So let's look at this question. The religious conscience offers the best guide to moral decision making. So the first thing to say is that there are really two different ways that you could approach this question. So the first way you could approach it is that you could limit the scope of the question to just being the conscience topic. So essentially, you could evaluate whether the religious conscience offers the best guide to moral decision making when you're comparing it to the non-religious views of the conscience. However, it's also important to note that you could approach this question in a much broader way, because the wording says the religious conscience offers the best guide to moral decision making, which is very open. So essentially what the exam board have done is that they've left room here in this wording of this specific question for you to compare religious conscience, religious views of the conscience, with other guides to moral decision making. So potentially you could therefore compare the religious conscience and the guidance that it provides for moral decision making with the guidance that's provided through ethical theories such as situation ethics, natural moral law, divine command theory, etc. So there's two different ways to approach the question. Neither one is better than the other. So the first thing that we should really do when we're looking at a question, a 15 marker, is to really consider the specific wording of the question very carefully. So when questions are being developed, the specific words are discussed quite extensively. So here, the phrase that we really need to consider carefully is best guide to moral decision making. So before you launch into just kind of comparing religious conscience to something else, really think carefully about what that phrase means. What would make something the best guide to moral decision making? Do you think that would be if it's very clear, if it's absolute, so there's no room for flexibility? Do you think flexibility makes something the best guide to moral decision making? Do you think the ease of application makes something the best guide to moral decision making? So whatever you think, when you reflect on that, that's something that you then need to engage with in your answer. We want to really try and move away from just kind of giving like a pros and cons list for religious conscience, and to engage in perceptive discussion, which is what the exam board are looking for in the top answers, means that you are really thinking carefully about the specifics in the question. So thinking about what the best guide to moral decision making would actually look like, and then consider the extent to which religious views of the conscience would provide that. Okay, so before you decide on your thesis, before you decide what you're going to argue in your answer, you need to give careful consideration to those specific words. So once you've decided what you think the best guide to moral decision making constitutes, or what you think that would be, the next stage is that you have to set out a really clear and supportive thesis or statement of intent at the start. The reason that's important is that one of the criteria that the examiner will be looking for in your work is the level of focus that you have on the question. And there's nothing that signals your level of focus as much as literally setting out at the start what you're intending to argue. So I've written here an example of what a thesis statement could be like at the start of your essay. Not to say that this is the best that there could be. It's not a model, but it's just an example for you of what I mean by saying you need a clear and supported thesis at the start. So what you'll notice is that in my very first sentence, I've given my own personal definition for what I think the best guide to moral decision making would mean. So I've said that I think it would mean that it would be very clear and easy to apply. I've then gone on and given kind of what my main argument is going to be in my essay. And the key thing is that I've given a reason to say why I'm going to argue that. Okay, so I've given kind of an indication to the examiner of what the focus of my essay is going to be, which is really important. Okay, the next thing that the examiner will be looking for in your 15 marker is that you're including discussion between the different views. So what we don't want in an A-level 15 marker is for you to give all the arguments for the statement and then all the arguments against, because that's not really a discussion. Okay, that's just the presentation of one side and then a presentation of the other side. Showing discussion between different views means it sort of needs to go backwards and forwards, like an actual genuine discussion would do. And so it's a really good strategy to use to add discussion between the different views in every section and to flag that up to the examiner. So my favourite word for showing that is just the word however, because it allows you to connect the two different views together. So again, I've given you two different examples there of what that could look like. Okay, and you should be trying to do this in each section. So once you've given kind of an argument to support your thesis, to support the side of the argument that you're going for, you then need to directly counter that, okay, to show that discussion between the views. Okay, so that's really important next step. Another key strategy that you should use is to regularly restate your thesis. So to try and show the examiner that you are clearly focusing on the question and you're clearly focusing on your line of argument, you need to keep on giving little mini conclusions. And again, this should really happen at least a couple of times during your answer. Okay, so you can see there an example of what that might look like. Okay, so it's sort of a mini conclusion to show that you are keeping your focus on the question. So one of the things that I always recommend that you should do is read each paragraph, each section of your work in isolation. Maybe get somebody to read it who doesn't take the subject and see if they could tell you, having read a paragraph, A, what the question is that you're trying to answer, and B, what your overall argument is. And if they can't do that, then that means it's not focused enough on the question. Okay, so that's a kind of rule of thumb that you can use. Now, obviously, at the end of your answer, you need to show that you've reached a clear and overall conclusion. So importantly, your conclusion needs to match your thesis. It needs to match what you said you were going to set out to prove at the start. It also needs to match with your reasoning throughout. There should be no surprises in your conclusion. It shouldn't be that the examiner gets to the end of your work and they're like, oh, now I know what they're arguing. Because if that's the case, then you've not shown clear enough focus throughout. So just a reminder here of kind of what we're looking at in the top answers. So for level 5, 13 to 15 marks, your answer needs to be very well focused. It needs to be really clear, as I said, from every single paragraph, every single section, what your question is, so what the question is that you've been set, and also what your overall argument is. Okay? Secondly, we're looking for perceptive discussion. So one of the ways that you can show perceptive discussion is to really grapple with the specific wording in the question, like I said before. So try not to just kind of see the question, see the general gist of the question, and launch into just kind of giving a very general answer. Okay, if you do that, you're going to struggle. Okay, to get into level 4 even, or especially level 5. Okay, so try and think really carefully about what the specific focus is in the question. Those phrases like best guide to moral decision making, think about what they actually mean. Okay, critical analysis is also needed for level 4 and level 5. Essentially, that means that there needs to be some evaluation throughout. You need to be saying how different points of view can be countered directly, why a point that's offered may be not that strong. Okay, so you need to be showing some engagement with the material that you're presenting rather than just literally presenting kind of two different perspectives. Moving down to the third row, appropriate evaluation fully supported by reasoning. So again, there should be no surprises in your conclusion, and throughout your essay, it should all kind of work consistently. You set out your thesis at the start, you keep coming back to it, you keep restating it, saying what you're trying to argue and why, and you keep on linking back throughout. It should be really clear what your argument is and what your main kind of reasoning is behind it. And lastly, be really careful with your use of subject vocabulary. Try and get in there the key terms. Try to get kind of key quotes in there if you can, if it's applicable, but certainly make sure that you're using the vocabulary appropriately.